I'm Erin Jean McDowell, and welcome to my fireside chat. Just kidding. Welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch Bite Size, where I'm going to be answering the 5 most commonly asked pie questions that I usually get. I get these questions all the time in my Instagram DMs, in YouTube comments, and I just wanted to put them all in one place so that you'd have them as you're getting ready to bake your pies this holiday season. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, be sure to click like and subscribe so you can be made aware of new episodes as they become available. Let's get started. First question, when and for how long should I chill my pie dough? People ask me all the time about when and how long they should chill their pie dough, and really it's a question that has a lot of possible answers. So it's really important to just remember the golden rule. When in doubt, chill it out. Pie crust loves to be cold at pretty much every stage. If it starts feeling warm or sticky, it needs to go into the fridge at any point while you're working with it. But my 3 primary places where I chill my pie dough, the first one is after mixing. After mixing the dough, you want to chill the dough both to relax the gluten that's formed so that it's easier to roll out, and also to firm up the fat. We want to make sure that that fat is nice and cold, both after mixing when we've been handling it a lot, before it goes into the oven. So after mixing, you're going to want to chill it for a minimum of 30 minutes, and I recommend chilling for at least 1 hour before continuing on with your pie preparation. If you want to get ahead, you can make your pie dough up to 2 days ahead of time and store it in the refrigerator or in the freezer for up to 3 months. The second stage where I like to chill my dough is before crimping. Now, in my cookbook, The Book on Pie, I mentioned that this is an optional chilling stage. Most recipes don't tell you to do it, but it is something that I always do. After I line the pie plate and I get my edges prepared for crimping, I go ahead and refrigerate that dough a little bit before I am ready to crimp. Now, this can be a really short chill time, just 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If it's gonna be anything longer than 15 minutes, go ahead and cover your pie with some plastic wrap so that it doesn't dry out in the refrigerator. But this chill time just is gonna help make sure that the dough is really nice and firm when we go to crimp it, and it's going to help our crimps stay in place a little bit better. The third time I like to chill is before baking, and this is one of the trickiest ones. It's really important to chill your pie before baking so that it has time for that crust to firm up, especially if the handling has taken a good amount of time. Our hands are warm, we're applying heat to the crust every time we touch it, so it's good to give it a little bit of chill time. The amount of time you need to refrigerate it at this stage is really going to depend on your environment, how warm it is in your kitchen, how cold your refrigerator is, and how much it warmed up in the process of making it. For example, I don't always need a ton of time of refrigerating it before baking, but I also can assemble my pies pretty quickly. Speedy crimping. If it takes you a little bit longer and you felt like you were sort of struggling through the process or just taking your time, then don't worry about it. Just toss it in the refrigerator for 30 minutes, an hour before you're ready to bake. So don't preheat until it's had a little bit of time to chill first. And remember, when it comes to pie crust, when in doubt, just chill it out. The next question, what kind of pie plate should I use? Now, like a lot of things, this is a bit of a personal preference, but as a professional baker, I can definitely give you some advice on what to look for in a good pie plate. The first thing to remember is remember the difference between a standard pie plate and a deep dish pie plate, and pay attention to what your recipe calls for. A lot of people don't realize that they're actually using a deep dish pie plate, and then they're kind of disappointed that they don't have quite as much filling as they were anticipating. A deep dish pie plate is, sorry, I just realized I don't know. Thank God I got a book that says all these things. Now, this is where Josh edits this in fast motion to me figuring out the proper answer. A deep dish pie plate is anything over 1.5 inches deep, or that would be 4 centimeters deep. So a standard pie plate is usually 1.25 to 1.5 inches, 3 to 4 centimeters. And a deep dish is anything greater than that 1.5 inches, 4 centimeters. So be sure that you check the depth of your pie plate before you get started, just to make sure that you're following what the recipe is calling for. The next piece of advice I want to offer is that I started baking pies using mostly glass pie plates. And if you actually look back on some of my earliest times writing about pie, I really recommend glass pie plates. And the reason I recommend glass pie plates back then is because it really helps people with that visual of getting the crust properly baked, because you can actually see through the glass to see if the crust has properly browned. Unfortunately, that is the only thing I like about glass pie plates, is that you can see through them. I find that they give a lot of other problems to the crust because they just don't retain heat in the same way as their other pan counterparts, and I often find it's a little bit harder to get that crust as brown as I want it. So I've sort of ditched most of my glass pie plates and opted instead for metal or ceramic pie plates. This is my favorite kind of metal pie plate. It comes from USA Pan, and it is a non-stick pie plate, 9 inches. It's 1.5 inches deep. And this to me is just the perfect standard pie plate. It's also one of the most non-stick options that's available because it actually is made from a non-stick material right from the get-go. The ceramic pan, this is just kind of a standard white ceramic pan. And I do find that ceramic has a little bit more of a tendency to stick, especially if you don't properly bake the crust. So if you really want that sturdy pie moment, like the sturdy pie challenge I'm always talking about, you're gonna wanna maybe consider a metal pan. However, if you want ceramic or you already have your ceramic pans, make sure that you're looking for ceramic that has a nice glossy interior. That glossiness is going to help make sure that the crust isn't as prone to sticking and that the pie is going to release a little bit more cleanly when you go to slice it. So to sum it up, there's no wrong pie plate. Of course, in the episodes I have talked about pie, I also talk about baking in things like cast iron skillets, 9x13 pans, baking sheets. There's a lot of options, but if you are wondering which pie plates I turn to the most, it is my standard metal and plain ceramic pie plates. The third question, butter or fat melts out of my crust when it's baking. Why and how do I prevent this from happening? This is probably one of the most commonly asked questions that I get because it's actually the biggest problem with working with an all butter dough, which you guys know is my favorite. Butter has a lower melting point than some other ingredients that you might use to make a pie crust, like shortening. And that lower melting point, unfortunately, makes it a little bit tougher to work with because it is going to be more prone to melting in your hands or in the oven if conditions are not 100% perfect. Have you set your fire alarm off because butter melts out of your crust? So here is how you prevent it. If you're having this problem consistently, it may mean that you are not coating your fat fully in flour as you work. It's really important that as you are cutting in that fat, whether you're doing it by hand, pastry cutter, food processor, that occasionally you reach in and you make sure everything is tossed. If the fat pieces are not coated fully in flour, they don't have any kind of protection, and they're gonna be more prone to melting when they hit the oven, especially when you roll out your dough really nice and thin and that fat is shingled out. So first and most important thing, toss that fat so that it is fully coated in flour at every stage. If you're doing that and you're pretty sure that's not the issue, then you might wanna consider rubbing the fat in a little bit more. I'm a big proponent of leaving the fat in large pieces, especially for my extra flaky and rough puff methods. But also, I think a lot of people, they are listening to my instruction to leave the butter or fat in large pieces, and they might actually be leaving it a little bit too large. In the book on pie, I have a photograph that shows the exact size of the fat so that you can really compare and contrast while you're mixing and make sure that you're reaching the right amount. If you're mixing your fat in at walnut size and you're consistently having it melt out of the dough, go ahead and mix it a little bit more thoroughly. Mix it a little bit closer to the size of peas and try again. There may actually be an issue where it's not possible to keep the fat coated in flour because you're using such large pieces. Remember, in the extra flaky and rough puff methods, the way that that fat is incorporated is by rolling the dough out and performing folds. This makes the butter more distributed by the time it hits the oven. My third piece of advice is to make sure you are chilling your crust thoroughly, but maybe consider avoiding the freezer. I talk about this more in my book, but a lot of people come to me and they say, there's no way my pie wasn't cold enough. I froze it solid first and then I baked it. But I actually find that freezing can be one of the things that can cause butter to melt out of the crust. That sudden change of temperature, especially if your oven is not the most reliable or has hot spots, I notice that it can cause the fat to sort of start to melt out of the butter before the structure is set. And that's really what we're going for here. We're aiming to have the fat distributed in such a way that when it hits the heat of the oven, the water content in the fat is released, creating this kind of puff of steam as it evaporates. And that's what creates that lightness, that flakiness. So remember, keep the pieces of fat well coated with flour throughout the process. If you're having consistent trouble, consider mixing your fat in a little bit more thoroughly and keep the dough very, very chilled, but away from the freezer before you're ready to bake. Oh, one other little thing. Be sure that you're baking your pie on a parchment-lined baking sheet. That way, if some fat does melt out, you're not creating a big smoky mess in your oven, you're keeping it confined within the baking sheet. Next question, when do you par bake and when do you blind bake? So I talk about this a lot. I always like to point out the difference in these two for me. Par baking is when you partially bake a crust before adding a filling and baking it again. And blind baking is when you fully bake a crust because you're gonna add a filling to it that doesn't require being baked again. So that right there already gives you some of when you're gonna do it right kind of in that description. We pretty much only blind bake when we're dealing with a cold set filling or any kind of filling that doesn't require oven time. A great example of this would be chocolate cream pie or coconut cream pie, anything where we're just kind of pouring a filling in and letting it set to a fully baked crust. That is when you would blind bake. Par baking is a little bit more complicated because I actually recommend par baking pretty much any single crust pie. And even sometimes I par bake double crust pies. Because double crust pies take longer to bake, they don't always require par baking, but sometimes I still like to par bake them. I wrote an article about how to do it because it is a little bit tricky, and we're gonna put the link to that down in the video description below if you wanna check it out too. But mostly I recommend par baking for any single crust pie. Anytime you're not putting a crust on the top, I par bake the crust for my pumpkin pies, my pecan pies, definitely for fruit pies if they are single crust or they have a streusel top, something like that. Par baking, pretty much any single crust pie, blind baking, only when the filling doesn't require any oven time. Last question, why won't my crimping keep its shape? I get a lot of people coming to me, they're so happy with the way their pie looked before baking, but then they put it into the oven and the crimping becomes a little wonky or it doesn't stay as even. The first thing I want to say about this is that while I enjoy very much making a beautiful pie, I really, really believe that even the most beautiful pie is a little wonky somewhere, and even the wonkiest pie is still so beautiful. So just remember, pie crust by nature, with all that flake and all that wonderful stuff going on, it's not really meant to keep a rigid shape the same way a firmer dough like sugar cookie dough might. And even think about when you bake something like sugar cookies. Sometimes you cut out a shape like a star, and as it bakes, the edges become a little bit softer and more rounded. The same thing is what's happening with your pie crust. In the oven, that organic nature of it, especially with flaky crust, it's gonna behave the way it wants to behave, especially in the heat of the oven. The problem that I find the most often is that people don't understand that the flakier the crust, the less likely it will to be tamed. So my crimps are a little bit less pristine on my flakier crust pies than they are on something that uses maybe pâte brisée or something with a shorter, mealier texture. So if you really, really want a certain decorative look, consider mixing your fat in a little bit more fully into your initial pie dough. That's going to give you less flake, but it will result in a really tender, crumbly crust that's going to hold its shape a lot better. If you are insistent on using a flaky crust, practice makes perfect. Does that work? Practice will make you so much better at your crimping. And really, a lot of people say to me, you know, every year my pie doesn't turn out as good as I want it to. But then I also ask them, is that the only pie you made this year? Because if you save making a pie for just that big holiday season, that one time a year, you're never gonna get that muscle memory that us bakers are always talking about. So practice making pies a few times. Remember, practice makes pie-fect. I tried. Thank Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Bake It Up a Notch Bite Size, where I answered the 5 most commonly asked pie questions. If you've got more questions for me, I'd love to hear it. Be sure to throw them in the comments below. You never know, they might end up on a future Bite Size episode. Thanks as always for joining me. Be sure to click like and subscribe so you're made aware of new videos as they become available, and we will see you next time. Happy baking!